This episode of Instant Analysis is brought to you by Platinum Storage Group and Real Estate Investments. For USCFootball.com, I'm Keely Eure here with Dan Weber. Instant analysis of Day 8 of the Todd McNair NCAA trial. Yesterday we got to hear from Rod Uphoff, who was the non-voting observer on the Committee on Infractions for the USC case. He also was the appeals coordinator, so if the case went to appeals, he would be able to coordinate that and help argue that case. So we heard from him yesterday. Bruce Brulette got to talk to him, and now today the NCAA had their chance to talk to him. It seemed like today the NCAA was trying to create a personal background for Uphoff, so the jury got to know him a little bit better.
Yeah, I would describe today as rehabilitating Rod Day, and they tried right away. I think because I kind of indicated maybe he threw some of the members of the committee under the bus who were voting members because they were newcomers or didn't really get what was going on in the process and what have you. And today I think he, right at the beginning, he went out of his way to say how much respect he had for them and how good they were, on the committee, and maybe they disagreed, but So I think they were trying, and they went into his background as a walk-on basketball player at the University of Wisconsin, and went to the London School of Economics, and then came back to Wisconsin for a law degree, and was a guy who, and in his law professor job, he teaches about legal clinics or, underserved populations and all that. So I think they were definitely trying to make him, a fairly sympathetic figure. And that's also, he spends half the year at the University of Missouri, half the year in South Africa as a law professor kind of running legal clinics. So, they didn't quite say he's St. Francis of Assisi, but they made him into, you got to like this guy. He's really just trying to do a really good job.
Mm-hmm. I think to prove how serious the committee took the USC case, the NCAA kind of made a demonstration of how many pages of documents went into this case. Rakesh, the lawyer for the NCAA, wrote out all the numbers, had Uphoff say how many page numbers went into each document. So that whole demonstration happened, and then Brulette came up in his cross-examination and said, well, how many pages of the findings report actually had to do with Todd McNair? And only 5 of the pages actually had to do with Todd McNair. So how did that kind of play out for the court?
Yeah, I thought it was kind of one of those old legal tricks where they piled them up. 4 volumes of 500 pages each, and and a case summary and all of this stuff. They ended up coming up with, I think, 2,700 and some pages. And then Bruce was able to say, and how many of those at the very end were about Todd McNair. So, it was a little bit of a Perry Mason moment, where they would pile all these on the witness stand. But I mean, they've got to do something like that. I think they want to say, hey, we really tried hard to get it right, and maybe we made some mistakes, but we were trying. I think one of the weakest points is they admit this was the most difficult NCAA case. I mean, he did. And yet, when you look at it, he was only his second hearing, his first ever as an appeals coordinator. A number of the people that he went through the list of the voting members were new or almost new or whatever. And it's really interesting how this group of people ended up, and you had Richard Johannenmeyer as an investigator who was kind of on his way to retirement, and Angie Creeders, who was pretty much brand new at the job. And I think one of the things they said today was what made it so difficult, last so long, and that was that USC fought so hard, which USC did. I mean, people who want to say now USC really didn't do as much as they could. The first 3-4 years, they did a lot, and they presented a really good case. And the NCAA didn't like it that USC, people like Roscoe Howard were saying things like, well, this is supposed to be cooperative. And when USC would mention, for example, you got the phone call wrong between Lake and McNair, it was like, you're not cooperating with us. You're trying to, or, when USC would have questions about the photo or some, a lot of the evidence, it was like making some people mad that USC was not engaged in a cooperative process, but they were engaged in a cover-up, is what some of the people at the NCAA were kind of indicating.
Yeah. In his last point yesterday, Brule talked to Uphoff about the penalties before and after the committee reached a consensus on Todd McNair. Uphoff remained steady in his answer that the penalties had nothing to do with Todd McNair, and that carried over into today with the NCAA questioning him. He said it had nothing to do with Todd McNair. In fact, it was a compromise on the proposed TV ban that they had thought about. And then Bruce Boyle came up and was like, well, let's look at the 18 proposed penalties before the Todd McNair decision. Where is the TV ban proposed? It was not in the 18 list of 18 possible penalties. And then Uphoff couldn't really give an answer of when the TV ban was actually proposed. So that was kind of a gray area that was never really answered.
Yeah, but I think they've tried to say, we think it was Paul D's idea, Chairman Paul D's idea. And anyone who has thought about the idea of a TV ban, which is something that I think it happened in the 50s, I'm not sure it even ever happened in the 60s, you can't have one. I mean, the TV contracts are signed. I mean, what is Notre Dame going to give back the money to NBC for the Notre Dame game not being on TV? I mean, if you put a TV ban in, you penalize Notre Dame. Are you going to penalize every other Pac-12 school by saying none of the USC games, which is for most of these schools their biggest game, those can't be on TV? It was a ridiculous proposal that wasn't serious. And when they say, oh, we thought of it, they did not. They did not think about it. They knew they couldn't do that. But it looks like somebody put it in there to say, well, we can take it out and say, see, we weren't going so hard on USC, were we? And we could make up for it by changing the scholarship penalties and the bowl ban penalty and what have you. And we can sort of, as they use the word, compromise.
Yeah.
So, but that they put it's a red herring that they put the bowl or the TV ban in there. That's not a serious argument and shouldn't be a serious point. Maybe you do have to have a little more sense of how college football works, or we'll see how Bruce and company handle that going forward. But I'm a little surprised that they went, that they even mentioned it. It wasn't serious.
Mm-hmm. There was also talk about the timeline of when the committee made their decision on Todd McNair. Both NCAA and Bruce Brule asked about it, and Rod Uphoff couldn't give much clarity as to when the committee made their final decision about Todd McNair.
Yeah, that's kind of an amazing point because they're making the case that Bruce, a non-voting observer whose role only kicks in when they go to appeals, was supposed to be kind of riding herd on everything. He read every page. It took him 50 to 100 hours. He wanted to be up to speed on every single question, every single factual point that's brought up. And so they say, well, okay, you guys met at the end of January. By end of February, and by March, you were still back and forth on the phone, but clearly no decision on Todd McNair. And he said, and Bruce said, did you make it in April? No, I don't think so. In May? I'm not quite, well, we've issued the final report June 10th. But for the fella who basically says, my job, I'm a lawyer, a law professor, my job was to be on top of every single thing that happened in this case, he couldn't say when the decision was ever made. Could not tell you a date as to how did they finally get this resolved, because apparently if they'd gone in, because they said not by May 10th, if they had gone to May 10th, so basically they haven't had a decision the end of February, all of March, all of April, and by May 10th, something is holding up the decision, clearly. And how did it get made? We don't know. It's a kind of a weakness, I would think.
Mm-hmm. We mentioned yesterday how today was a lighter day just because some of the lawyers had to attend a funeral today, so we only had the afternoon session, 1:30 to 4:30. Monday, we will hear 2 depositions. Who will we be hearing from?
Well, Roscoe Howard, who was is the buddy of Rodney Uphoff, and he's a former federal prosecutor in District of Columbia in private practice, and he is the fellow who wrote the really incendiary email going after the enforcement staff, among others, because he thought they were way too easy on USC. They should have brought in those tapes, which were illegal in California, to listen to. And the NCAA got a legal opinion, said, no, we can't do that. The Lloyd Lake tapes. And then he also thought they should have brought in all the dog, and they kept calling it dog fighting stuff, which is a misnomer. And that was not the case of what actually happened. But the committee decided we aren't going there. Although they huddled up, and then he did admit that they huddled up in the back of the room where nobody could hear them. And then they did get, even though it took them a month to get the transcript, they did get the part about Todd McNair and the dogs. They did get that printed out and transcribed for the committee. So some of the little snippets probably don't do them a lot of good, but they basically were relitigating the entire case, every part of it that involves Todd McNair, and a lot that involves Reggie Bush. And there's just a whole lot of stuff being thrown up on the wall and seeing what sticks. But today was one of those days. I think, if I had to guess, the strategy was, let's hope they don't pay attention, and maybe we're good to go. We tried hard. We did a lot of stuff. Give us a break.
Yep. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for day 8 of the Todd McNair NCAA trial. For Dan Weber, I'm Keely Eure. For more, check out uscfootball.com.